Yeah. Hi, guys. How's it going? It's me, Lucius, and we are here with Looshes Labs Podcast, episode number 5, with Mr. Dave Zed or David Rossi, um, founder of the Gen Z podcast, as well as SALT, Strategic Analysis of Longitudinal Technologies. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Alexi. It's an honor. And as you know, as some of you, hopefully, some of those watching afterwards or listening may know, Alexi and myself go way back to probably 2 or 3 years ago at this point. And I've had him on, he's had me on. And Alexi is one of the best people I know all around. So thank you so much for having me on, man. I really appreciate it.
You're way better at being nice. I'm like, I try, Dave's the man. Let me just put it that way.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I mean, as we had discussed before recording, there's such an unlimited scope of what we can talk about that it's just we figured that we would focus in on just a few things, and some of those things I guess were pertaining to what we could say gravity waves and things like that, I guess.
Yeah, I think people would be really interested in understanding what you do with SALT in a way as well.
Sure.
And what that even means, because you've heard people like Dr. Stephen Greer bring up scalar waves.
Right.
When I wrote my series of books, I use the terminology, the scaled waveform.
Right.
But then there's other people such as Dan Winter, and I believe yourself, term that longitudinal waves.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, wherever you want to go with it, we can go. So.
Sure. Well, first off, let me just say again, thank you so much for having me. One of the things that I want to point out, and I'll just I got a pen and paper with me here just to point out, is that this brings everything full circle with how I got started, what I'm doing with SALT and all of that. But the idea is in mathematics that we have an X and a Y plane. We see here, right, as the Cartesian plane. But there's this proposal or this notion that there's a what's called a third time derivative, or a sort of missing component to Einstein's GR, all that kind of stuff. And it seems as though that it has to do with something called the Z-axis. And that is this notion or idea that essentially all around us in the vacuum or the ether, or what we call empty space, there are these, amongst all these different particle fluctuations that are always in movement, there are all these basically rings all around us, but there are these longitudinal, we could say vertical, very thin strings made of pure raw energy that in quantum field theory, they are there, but they're also not at the same time. And this gives rise to inducing I guess we could call it a third access to the X and Y plane, which would, generally speaking, look something like this. Here we go, which would be the Z-axis now being added to the X and Y. Now we can talk about how geometrically this is, reminiscent of things like the Ankh, or things that, for example, that have been seen in ancient Egypt, Hebrew Sanskrit, even Ed Laskalman's work, all that kind of stuff, tuning forks, all these different things. But the reason I bring this up is because there's this notion that there's been an entire component from physics that is used in other areas of physics, but not in engineering, that has been completely removed, and dare I say, conspiratorially motivated to be removed, because it would induce and give us access to things, for example, like over unity generators and energy, free energy, gravitational waves, which would give rise to teleportation, traversable wormholes, being able to see things in the near or distant future relative to a linear perspective of time. And what we do at SALT, which stands for Strategic Analysis and Assessment of Longitudinal Technologies, SAALT, based out of the US, is that we do our best to try and essentially consult and experiment and work on various forms of what we could say are condensed matter physics and electrical engineering components, mainly, amongst other things, because this field in general requires expertise of chemistry, your expertise as well, as we've talked privately, and all these different areas and fields that I just don't have the skill in. And so basically the idea is to try and bring out a lot of this knowledge, technology, and all of that in the short term and the long term for the better. Basically use the methods that these negative groups of people have been using against the average person for so long, and flipping it around the other way. essentially, not in a conniving or manipulative way, but simply to just say, okay, well, the key to this fight is transparency, in my opinion. So let's bring that transparency forward more. And so, long story short, that's what I'm up to now between that and the show. What got me here was basically using, and I'm more comfortable to say it now, I think this will be the first time I've said it publicly, utilizing electrostatics and a combination of other electromagnetic high frequencies to induce a what we could say is a gravitational wave. And this is what brought me on the path of all of this a couple years ago. With a couple $1,000s saved up and some trips to the local hardware store, I was able to, albeit I did a couple things that one probably should not do in order to get the power density high enough to get what I was trying to achieve. And essentially, I had achieved what I was trying to do. It is of my humble opinion that I generated a gravitational wave. And so from there, it did not help that 40 minutes from where I was staying at the time, there was a military base there, and some jets had come flying over within a very short time of this occurring. And so between that and then being, I guess you could say, found or approached by certain groups of some that are public, some that are not, that are both in and or connected to DoD or private contracting and all of that. I've basically been in the, if you could say, in the thick of it the last 2 to 3 years, and am trying to really bring the positive side of things out through SALT and through the very basis of this concept right here.
Well, that's what I wanted to circle it back to, was that
Sure.
concept alone. Because you could say that the XY plane, and correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but you could say that our XY plane is somewhat our dimensional layer that we can perceive.
Absolutely. This is, as a matter of fact, I think this is where it doesn't become, am I interviewing you or you are interviewing me? I think you have some stuff that I don't, and I have things you don't, so it works great. So this is where I would fully agree with you. I would actually defer to you to confirm that, but I would say very much so, yeah.
And then that's where the Z axis, in a layman's way, you could say, is either time. So towards the past or towards the future, or in another way, less dense or more dense realms.
Very much so, which also speaks to brain theory, not brain like the mind, but BRANE.
Exactly. Well, there's different membranes of essentially collapsing waveforms.
Right.
What I wanted to show here to the audience is just so you have the XY plane. I have my drawing out as well.
Yeah.
So you could say the XY plane of our dimension would be that green shell, and you can see how the past and future are perceived by a body existing within the green shell. And so that red shell, you could say, is an outer brain. The blue shell is inward, and the purple shell inward would be inner brains. And so that's really where I think physics is kind of at this point too, is understanding what exists beyond our dimension, whether outward or inward, right?
Very well put. And I couldn't agree more. As a matter of fact, to that point, it is of my opinion that when a gravitational wave is emitted, it ends up looking somewhat like this relative to its local field around it. And I'm going to bring this full circle to what you just showed. And my drawings are not as good as yours, so forgive me. But there's this idea that, again, we have the X and the Y plane, or axis, excuse me, and then we have the Z or the Z axis. And the thing here about this is that it's never been officially confirmed in the public literature post-World War II in academia that the smallest forms of matter are cubes. But we see, for example, people like Otis T. Carr, a protege of Einstein and Nikola Tesla, who had built a successful craft that was able to traverse space and time, I believe in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken, and then was shut down, attacked by the various agencies, FBI, and so on and so forth. He had stated in a public radio interview that the smallest forms of matter are cubes. And it's interesting to see that this was stated back then, and to note today that we have scientists who I know for a fact that are working on the same thing they say is not possible publicly, are working with these Planck cubes privately. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I believe that the gravitational waves first are emitted longitudinally / vertically, and they're opened up in a wormhole-like fashion through a tapering of energy. And these frequency shifts that ultimately lead to what we call the red shift and blue shift of things have to do with these Planck cubes and the frequencies, for lack of a better term, riding them out. to from the throat of the wormhole, if or vortex, if you will, that then rides its way out. And what's interesting about this is two final things I will say, which is that Hochberg and Visser out of Los Alamos showed that all one needs to understand or know is the throat of a wormhole, and then you can understand the rest because it's fractal, and you integrate it from there, which speaks exactly to these Planck cubes and how the z-axis would fit when a z-pinch or some type of explosion via implosion would occur, where basically particles, for lack of a better term, for simplicity's sake, the particles are making love instead of fighting, if you will, which we can argue is what phase conjugation and harmony is, that your books also cover so beautifully. And the final thing is that if we take this visual and draw with my mouse here, just the sort of, the connecting shape for the points in which that are not actually part of the upper squares, we would get Pythagoras' theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared, which speaks to this idea of electrical potentials being the basis for perhaps inducing a lot of these effects that mainstream physics seems to deny, but our ancestors seem to very adamantly support. So long story short, hopefully that doesn't, I didn't get too far off there, but I would like to say that everything I've said here is a compliment to what Alexei, and is in addition to what Alexei had showed from the drawing in his book. So I think that that's the best way I can probably describe it. And if I can give one final visual, what you just saw there, folks, was a zoomed in version of the sort of the way the caduceus moves. It is of my humble opinion that whether it's for healing or propulsion or what have you, these gravitational waves tend to actually operate in this sense, and there's a peanut-like ebb and flow to them. They are smaller versions of the larger, you could say, caduceus that creates the entire boundary of it. So again, it's fractal. And we see here again, HFGW stands for high frequency gravitational waves. And then this would be your y-axis and then your x-axis. And then of course your longitudinal one with your peanut, so to speak, at the center point, which speaks to your orbital processions of synchronicity and harmony. So I'll stop there, but that's where how my mind views it, at least.
No, I think that's great. And one thing to note though, you had the stacking of different layers almost, right? And I think one thing that Dan Winter likes to speak on is how those are all related to the Fibonacci sequence as far as distance from that primal point, right? So you have the Planck length, and every one of those different brains, essentially, I don't know if I'm using the right words here, but every one of those different layers is somewhat related to the Planck times the golden ratio, to a certain value.
To three different integer states, you get the radius or radii of hydrogen, which seems to be if not certainly one of the building blocks of this reality, absolutely, which then gives rise to the notion of plasma being the sort of sticky glue of our reality, and this idea of what's called a BEC, a Bose-Einstein condensate, being the next form of the fourth form of matter, or the solid liquids, the fourth or fifth form of matter. There's this notion behind the scenes that Bose-Einstein condensates, or superfluids as you call them, are significantly different than plasmas. Traditional.
Would that be a fluid that's not being perceived, so it's not necessarily in a state of space or time, or something of that nature? Or?
The idea with superfluids is that there's no viscosity, essentially. There's no kinetic viscosity. So they essentially they can allow for the charge carriers within the fluid to enable superpositioning.
Okay.
Which speaks directly to your books and your work. This idea of orbital processions overlapping each other and then not, and then returning back. And it's literally that. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
That's where there's an underlying amplitude associated with each of those waves overlapping as well, too, right? So if the waves on this side, and the waves on the other side, they cancel, nothing transpires. But when the waves are on both sides, you almost get like a tidal wave of energy. So an amplitude is created there, which you could translate into power, or
100%. And then if you were to take that and we go with the notion of what you talk about in your books, forgive me, I don't recall the exact term at the moment, but the different membranes, or the different, what do you refer to them specifically in your book?
I like to think of dimensions as in perceivable dimensions for human consciousness. And so I'd say that our universe is basically the alpha verse or the beta verse, because we're only really experiencing our physical dimension when we're in that 10 or 20 hertz state. And
okay.
So, right here, I have all those in a way. I have our universe is the green shell, centered around 20 hertz. And then you could say that the lower verse would be closer to 0.625 or just slower in general. And that the noviverse is a faster or denser realm.
So that is a beautiful illustration, and my notion there would be, say for example, we're on the top verse, if you, or universe,
exactly, our universe looking inward towards the faster frequencies, which ultimately make the matter as it's condensing into,
because by definition it has to condense, and by that condensing what you then have is that peanut shape, as we just saw. So you have your ebb and flow, and not only that, but I would even add to what you said, the potential notion that whenever someone taps a zero state, that there's two different zeros. There's the zero state of when nothing happens in one dimension, and then there's the 0 point or the zero state that gets accessed, that creates basically a ripple in space-time to the next one.
Right. And those ripples propagate outward as gravity waves. Am I correct in saying that? Or
I would certainly say that gravity waves can enable that, without a doubt. I would certainly say, what's interesting too is that gravity waves, they move, how can I put this there? So you know how in normally electromagnetism, gravity, it's been known that a current is proportional to the square of the electric, the waveform or the wave function is proportional to the square of the current of the electromagnetic aspect of that particular, let's just say it's a Gaussian beam, for example. Gravity waves are not. Gravity waves have to do strictly with mass. So what's interesting is that a gravity wave will go through everything and anything until it hits an object in which the object's mass, not the weight, but the mass, is directly proportional or greater than the amount of mass that gravity wave is carrying.
Is that in order to create like that harmony of zero? Would that be like a reasoning behind that? In order to have it be zero, essentially?
In order for it to basically ebb and flow, but I guess, dare I say, a layer below the material part of this reality. So it would be basically invariant in that sense. So it would constantly have this, it's sort of like when you're at the bottom of a pool and then you look up and you see the surface and you see people swimming on the surface, but they don't see you at the bottom. The gravity wave in this case is at the bottom of the pool going, hey, I can breathe forever. I don't need to go up for air, and I don't have to touch any of you unless there is someone that the gravity wave comes in contact with that's just as big or bigger than them.
Interesting.
If that makes sense. And that's basically, yeah, the swimming pool example is probably the closest example I could give to how the gravity waves would generally work, to how I know it to be. So
well, it also speaks on the concept of the different brains as well, right? Where the surface of the pool would be one layer, underneath you have a different layer.
Right, exactly. So it makes it makes you think quite a bit about what could be done with that. If you have something that can go through basically anything and everything and treat everything physical like it's programmable matter, as if it's been organically programmed from our from what are the different states that you have in your book, the brainwave states?
Delta, theta, alpha, beta, slow gamma, fast gamma.
And what are we considered to be in when we're awake?
Alpha and beta.
Alpha and beta. Okay, so the idea would be, for example, that gravity would be traveling, I'm just making this up, but on the gamma wave, for example, while we're in alpha beta mode. And then essentially when we're asleep, the opposite happens, but because we're not there to perceive it, we wouldn't know. And then the same thing applies to everybody else, which speaks to this idea of you being the center of your reality truly.
Yeah, and I think one thing I find that very fascinating. Sorry, I was gonna almost shift over.
Sure.
Because people are talking about the non-human intelligences. I'm not trying to catch you in anything here either, And
No. Yeah.
Gary Nolan has spoken about how experiencers have heightened states of intuition, which typically relates to the delta and theta waves.
Right.
What do you think could be going on with that?
I think, okay, so if this is purely, I have no data. I think what's happening is
we're just speculating, people.
Sure.
Yeah.
So if we think of this idea, if we go back to the X and Y axis, we think of, for example, we're told our DNA, there's only, you got the blue strand, you got the red strand. What if there's a third strand of our DNA that is at the nano level that can only be viewed with, say, a quantum detector, if you will, that can only be viewed at the nano level, but it's dielectric and it's conductive. It's made out of copper and gold and a couple of other things. what if that third strand in some people, whether through meditation and training and what they call shadow work, or naturally in some cases, the same way that if you go to the gym, sometimes, you can grow muscles faster than others. You just genetically, it's just the way you are. Some people can go to the gym for 30 minutes. They're great. Other people got to go there for hours a day. If we apply that same method or approach to the possibility of people having more spiritual and genetic predisposition, pre-expositions to this third strand in particular, there may be some that are able to, for lack of a better term, embed with these other brains, if you will, or dimensions more, I guess you could say, fluidly, rapidly, quicker than others. I also think it has to do quite a bit with two things: what we talked about earlier, which I don't know if I fully addressed, scalar fields, as well as the one's own spiritual state and emotional state. I feel as though one needs to be at pure I don't want to say perfect, because that's even relative too. One needs to be happy with themselves and needs to be able to forgive themselves and needs to be able to be confident in themselves and not let anything drag them down or let either anxiety get in the way of their thoughts, because that will essentially affect the third strand, which is constantly in a fluxing state, both within our bodies and within this, what we call empty space or the vacuum or the ether all around us, which these scalar fields enable. And scalar means, if I'm not mistaken, purely magnitude and no direction. So an energy would be going everywhere, in just all over the place with no direction.
More like a light bulb, just spraying light in all different directions.
Right.
A laser or something like that.
Right, exactly. And so to me, this notion of when people talk about, is our gravity waves, scalar waves, and this and that, in my opinion, there's an argument to be made there, because when you look at the way that gravity waves allegedly operate, it seems as though they're the layer below this particular material layer, or a sub-layer below this particular material layer within the larger layer of things that we're in. And so to me, it speaks to this idea that, well, hold on, gravity waves tend to be able to avoid anything physical from getting in its way, unless that physical thing's internal mass matches the mass of that gravitational wave. And so what we're seeing is the ability, no matter what, for gravity waves to be able to travel. And that's what, in my opinion, what scalar means, what it does, how it would operate, indicating that the magnitude is all over and infinite. So you can tap a gravity wave anywhere, no matter what. And I think that when we take that notion of scalar, if we were to view ourselves as organic gravitational generators, the scalar capability is already within us, which speaks to the notion to be able to, for example, meditate wherever you can go, to a park and meditate. I've seen some of your great videos when you're out about and walking, or you can have those same or similar thoughts on camera here right now. To me, that speaks to the notion that we are organic scalar gravitational generators in and of ourselves, because if we weren't, we would need to go to certain areas or physical locations to be able to think certain thoughts or to have this conversation or so on and so forth. So I think that what we're seeing is a hidden secret that's been right in front of us, because it is us in addition to many other things.
Well, the one thing you spoke on was basically, what's a good way of putting it? Brain harmony and not holding grudges, being at one with yourself, right?
Right.
So what, just theoretically, kind of just spitballing here, so what happens when you have, I'm going to call it a doubt or an insecurity? Well, that means that your heart essentially is somewhat fighting your mind and your brain, right?
Right.
And so when you talk about the liquid spine pump, I mean, Dan Winter likes to speak about that, and how, you need to have harmony throughout the entire system. Right. If you're suffering some type of anxiety or a doubt, that means that your brain is literally like fighting against a natural flow. So in order to let go of that flow, it allows that harmony to actually take place.
I am completely with you in I've said it, and I may, because I'm putting this out for my members as well. My members may find this a bit repetitive, because I've said it so often, but I believe that, for example, one should live life, and it's just my opinion, very much like water. And I know Bruce Lee said that before. I'm not the first one to say it, but the notion of, for example, if you put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put it in a bowl, it takes the shape of the bowl. And if we take it one step further, this is the part that I humbly think I've added, which is that if we flow like water through life, as Bruce Lee has said, and if a rock gets thrown into that river, and in this case, the rock represents a problem in one's life, you deal with the rock when it comes, if it ever even comes, and then if it comes, you flow around it. So what you've done now is you've both lived in the present and have dealt with the problem without having to worry about that problem ahead of time, which is what is what causes anxiety.
Exactly.
So you've prevented anxiety, excuse me, while at the same time overcoming the problem, and it didn't even feel like anything. And to me, I find that the second someone in life tends to push against things, we have a great member on our Patreon, Devin, that gave a beautiful example, in my opinion, of just kind of forcing against something. No matter what it is, whether it's someone trying to strive to make more money, or whether it's someone trying to do this, or whatever the case is, trying to force a relationship that deep down may not end up working, or whatever, you end up pushing against the flow of what you could say is the cosmos, at least of this dimension or reality, and so on, and you're never going to win. And so I think the ultimate power is realizing that the looking within creates the ability for you to realize that I want to finish it with this. Things are not moving around you. You are moving through it, because you have given it existence. The very definition, the very thought of observation, and the very observation of something defines the boundaries and parameters that we create, that we see it as. So the very act of looking at something defines what it is.
Yep.
So yeah, so that was a bit of a ramble, but that's basically where I would go. Yeah.
Well, and that's where I always wonder, so what creates, well, actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to do a quick shout out to the sponsor for today.
Yeah.
And then to not leave my to not lose train of thought here, I want to say, well, what creates the flow of the river when we get back? It'll be what I like to talk about. So guys, I'm gonna do a quick share screen. And we have this right here. And this is today's sponsor. It's Sailor Made Charters out of Tampa. So if you are coming to Tampa and you want to go out on a boat, call up Sailor Made Charters, tell them Lucia sent you, and they'll give you a discount. That's Kayla. She's the captain. She does great work. Great job. And, sunset cruises, corporate event, office parties, cityscape, wildlife photography, beer can island, whatever you guys want to do, they'll make it happen. So just go ahead and check them out, and appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Let me do a stop share. We'll get right back into it. All right, so sorry for the distraction. I know we're in an intense conversation.
Next time I'm in Florida, I'm seriously gonna check them out. So yeah, that's fantastic. Sorry, we're talking about what causes the flow of the river.
So we're talking about almost being like Bruce Lee, right? Be like water. Right. Well, what causes that river? I have my thought behind it. I'll just go ahead and say it. I think it's the minds of it all, like a subconscious mind of the human collectiveness. But then you could even take that further to say another collective subconscious, another collective, maybe the mind of it all at the end of the day.
I think you kind of stole my answer. So first off, everything that Alexi just said for the audience, that's where I would go. And secondly, I would say that we are by definition the river itself. Now, when people may say, okay, well, how is the river, how is it powered, and so on and so forth, this is where I would take both your theories, Alexi, and mix them in with Mr. Penrose's, in the sense of, I think that you're correct in everything you said. I think that the driving force of that energy, if we were to follow it back, it's on its trail, if you will, in a metaphorical map sense, is not here, is not local. That's just my opinion. I could be wrong, but to me, that speaks to these different, not only just the different brainwave states, but also the different forms of fractality of the membranes and brain theory. This idea, for example, that, some have postulated we're living in a Klein bottle, our solar system is in a Klein bottle, so to speak. And this idea of, something non-local that's driving the energy flow of this solar system and of us is coming from somewhere else, if you will, that reaches in via quantum processes. When I say quantum processes, I mean superposition embedding, I mean phase conjugation, those kind of things that is happening externally or elsewhere, if you will, that is not here in this material sense.
It's
So I'm fully
essentially
with you.
outside of our space-time, or at
Right,
least outside of our perception, or what I like to just say dimension, right? At the end of the
right,
day, like
yeah,
our entire perception of the universe, you could just say is our dimension. Um,
right,
so
right.
I would like to say outside of it, but if you consider inner brains and outer brains, you could say
Yep.
that it comes from both sides, potentially.
This I would fully agree with you, because I would say that even when we look at the z-axis, as we've been discussing earlier, I've actually had someone on the Patreon bring this up before, where there's this idea of our great friend Ani, this idea of exoteric and then esoteric. So you have outwards and then you have inwards, and it's very interesting that you bring that up, and so does my great friend Ani, because when you look at the longitudinal wave of the z-axis, there's a paper from 1903 by Mr. E.T. Whitaker called the scalar, I believe it's called the scalar decomposition of the bidirectional longitudinal waves. And you have two different components of these scalar waves. So when you bring it back down to first principles, ontologically and philosophically, you're right on the money, in my opinion. There's an external and an internal part, and one cannot do without the other for the sake of that balance.
Right, right. And in order for our universe to have been created to begin with, there must have been something there for it to grow into, is the way I see it. But I'm thinking very spatially because I'm a human. So I'm thinking 3D space, and it's hard to not think like that, you know?
There's this, I mean, to your point, there's been speculation, for example, that for as incorrect as many of our public theories are, allegedly the Big Bang was not apparently super incorrect relative to how we could perceive something even remotely close to understanding that event happened, to perceiving how it happened. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. There's, I mean, this notion, for example, of, we're living in a state of entropy, and the opposite of that is negentropy, which would be the giant negentropic process of nature, which gives, so if we have gravity here, then in the negentropic state we could induce anti-gravity and so on and so forth, which also gives rise to the possibility that for every action there's not a reaction as much as there is an anti-action. But the point here is that if we followed that negentropic path back, or followed it back its trail, the idea would be that we'd be able to see at least the creation of this universe as we understand it. I don't know about the whole thing, and then we even have to debate as to whether or one would have to debate what context are we talking now, right? Because now we're talking so macro. But I think there's something there in that sense. I could be wrong myself, but yeah.
Well, it seems like the life itself is somewhat organizing, right? Just the idea
Right.
of matter, like my DNA creates the shape of my body ultimately, and that seems like it organized out of nothing in a way. So it's life itself is somewhat negentropy or synchronicity in a way, synchronizing matter to create something.
You bring up a fantastic point. If it wasn't for you saying that, I wouldn't have thought of this. There are some great papers out of Eastern Europe that cover basically the fractal, negentropic and entropic living states of this reality. And a lot of these papers have found that pink noise is a driving factor in the living systems, or the biofractal living systems of this
I'm not
reality.
familiar with that term, pink noise.
It's a sound.
Okay.
Type of sound. I think you can look it up on YouTube. I apparently it's a very relaxing sound. I could be wrong, but apparently it's the 1/f symbol, which is the pink noise. There's white noise, pink noise, and a bunch of other ones. Apparently pink noise is the course, which is an acoustic composition. This pink noise is apparently part, not the whole thing, but part of the, I guess you could say, the ground state of this reality, which seems to be ebbing and flowing in a self-organizing fractal sense, but it's bouncing in its own sort of state, if you will, but it's also chained and linked in with all of the other states of this reality, which then speaks to an oscillatory theory of, consciousness and reality,
Right.
because it's like everything's linked in chains. And I find it very cool because it's like if you unkink them, they're two separate things separately, but once you link them together, they become something completely different. So I find that to be interesting too, because it speaks directly to how you would tap anti-gravity, which is that electromagnetism, when certain conditions are met, become gravitic. And so that's when it gets interesting. So anyways, yeah.
Very interesting. No, so okay, what do you think about the shifting topics just a little bit, I guess? I know we only have about 10 minutes left for today,
Yeah.
but
Sure.
so you heard Grush in Congress. I'm not sure if you heard him, but he basically was like, oh, I think they might be interdimensional. This might be the holographic theory. What are your thoughts on non-human intelligence?
I think for me personally right now, I check off all of the above box in terms of morphological, holographic, morphogenic, ET, interdimensional ancestors from a long time ago, time travelers, the notion of, maybe 500 to 1,000 years ago, there was a group of our ancestors that are our great grandparents that made to a certain degree of broken off, have been in hiding, and have pretended to be ET so as to protect their own facilities here. There's a private America or a corporate America, private aerospace notion to this as well. I think it's all of the above. And I say that not to give a carte blanche type answer. I say that because to me, at least, the physics checks off all of the above from what I've researched so far. And the other thing I will say is that there is something that I do disagree on, if I may say, for the first time publicly on your show, which is that I personally disagree with Jeremy Corbell when he states that these things are not black projects or what have you. It is of my very humble view, some of them are, not all of them, but some. And the reason I bring this up is because, and again, to you and your audience, take this as you will, but I am very strongly of the opinion that there was a breakthrough many decades ago in reverse engineering, whether it was through knowledge of reverse engineering or through true human ingenuity or a bit of both. I think there was a breakthrough by mid-50s in terms of modern history. And so to say that all of it is not ours.
Yeah, I mean, for my personal, again, making a guess because I don't know the answer, but in my opinion, there is a very logical step-by-step process of human ingenuity, as you would say. Basically, Thomas Townsend Brown, right, 1920s had electrogravitics already going. And then I always say John Searle as well. 1950s and 60s, and then to go back even into the 1800s and even before that, well, we had airships. So to think that we haven't even tried to build an electrogravitic airship, to me just seems
I'll go one step further. It is of my opinion that the airship thing had to be debunked by a certain, we could say, group of individuals or we'll leave that for another time. But the airship notion had to be debunked, or the Hindenburg had to crash, in my opinion, because the route that the airships were, the route people were going in terms of understanding the mechanisms behind how airships worked would have led to anti-gravity and would have not been able to be suppressed in the way that it, in my opinion, has since been.
I forget what documentary I saw, and I believe it was two brothers were working on airships in the late 1800s, and they developed a technique that basically just used vortices of, I think, fluid, maybe water or mercury, one of the two, and that was the form of propulsion they were using on the airship.
So this is where I will say as well that if you look at the Paez slides in the Paez papers, without getting into detail, there are very stark similarities that Mr. Paez has in his patents, slides, and papers. I think the slides were leaked, but that are directly connected to some of the things that were used to power the airships.
Yep.
And one of those things I'll say, for example, would be an air compressor. So because there's more than one way to understand this science or this knowledge, if you will, and more than one way to implement it practically. But I would say that it's certainly not wrong in terms of the path that was being taken at the time.
Right. And so that's why it's so easy to think for me that more than half of them are probably man-made, logical step-by-step process, no reverse engineering required. Meanwhile, on the other hand, I have, in my personal experience, I've seen like a genuine UFO.
Right.
Like to me, it seemed like it was interdimensional though, and that's why I think all my work leads towards that. But that doesn't mean that beings aren't coming from other planets and traveling through different dimensions to get here, right?
Very well. I couldn't agree more. This is why I truly check off all of the above, because just because one has made a breakthrough in anti-gravity doesn't mean that you've made a breakthrough in everything there is to ever know ever.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I say that, for example, if we're at a certain pace, then maybe there are others that are far ahead, whether they're interdimensional or even in some cases, maybe groups that, 5, 10, 15, 20,000 years old that have broke away long ago and pretend to be ET in order to protect themselves. And so that our government wouldn't think to look for them here and give the illusion that they're leaving the planet when they really aren't. So no, I'm with you completely. I'm with you all the way. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I know we have maybe 4 minutes or something like that left.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to touch on? If not, I feel like, we've already gone over some pretty fun stuff.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit that we can leave for the audience to simmer on, and I think that I would love to do this again, but this time around, I mean, I'm going to post this on my channel as well, so we could call it like a swapcast, I guess. But I'd love to have you on or to do another one of these in 2 to 3 weeks from now. But I want to thank you so much for having me.
Yes, sir. I really appreciate your time and that you were willing to come on, so graciously. You're the man.
Thank you so much, man. Thank you so much. Just a friendly, just to let everyone know where I could be found, patreon.com/Generation Z, as well as you can email me, genzpodcast@gmail.com, Generation Z, Z-E-D, podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Podbean. And that's basically about it. So I just want to thank you so much again, man.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Take care.